Thanks, Christy. I think we will. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kathy Nickham. I'm the Education Director for the DTC Education Center. I am happy to share that our webinar today is sponsored by Frenova Renal Research. And we're going to be talking about clinical research this afternoon. The title of our webinar is Clinical Research 101, Participating in a Trial. And during this session, you'll hear how clinical research is so important to finding ways to improve quality of life and cures and better treatments for kidney disease. You'll also learn more about how to participate in studies. Christy, could you, thank you, you went to the next slide. A couple of housekeeping tools. Your phone lines are muted, as most of you have already heard, and you unmute by *6 and you mute by *6 and you unmute by #6. You can ask questions in the chat box, which some of you are. We are recording this session, and the slides will be available afterwards on our website. And please provide feedback to us at the end of the session. You'll have a form to complete. Our presenter today is Kirk Mussina. He has his MBA and works at Frenova Renal Research. Kirk brings 30 years of international business success to his role at Frenova, including a record of leadership and achievement, structuring and orchestrating global teams in the drug development industry. As general manager of Frenova, he is responsible for driving their charter to advance the science of renal therapies, support a profitable business and service line, and advance relationships with researchers in the nephrology community. Before joining Frenova, Kirk held a number of executive positions, including as president of Triangle Research Labs, senior vice president of business development for Active Solutions and Nuvella-X. He's also been vice president of business development and client services for Aptuit, and Vice President for Global Clinical Business Development for Inversic. Among other things, Kurt has earned a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from Montclair State University, and he also received his MBA from Duke University's Fuqua School of Business. So at this point, thank you for joining us, Kurt, and I will turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Kathy. Appreciate that introduction. Just a quick disclaimer that this afternoon, anything I express that's an opinion or my own view is mine and not necessarily that of my employer, who happens to be Fresenius Medical Care, or its affiliates. So I travel a lot, and a couple of months ago, I took a flight, sat down in my usual seat, which is 13A. I like the window, and I take row 13 because it's row 13, and some people avoid that. So quick tip, if you're looking for any hope of having an empty seat next to you, row 13 is the place to be. And I settled in with a crossword puzzle from USA Today, and I still have that crossword puzzle. It's not because I couldn't finish it, although that is often the case. But in this instance, I found the crossword puzzle a little bit disturbing. And I remember the clue. It was 27 down, and the clue was clinical trial volunteers. It turns out that the answer that they were looking for to clinical trial volunteers was guinea pigs, which I found rather unfortunate. And I can appreciate the reasons why some folks might connect the words research and guinea pig. But I think if someone better understands clinical research and how it works and why it's so important towards advancing the science behind healthcare, this concept of people as guinea pigs will hopefully fade away. At least that's my hope this afternoon as we conduct clinical research. So the topics this afternoon, clinical research, what is it? How does it work? I'll cover some of the various types of clinical research. We'll talk about the reasons why clinical research is important and why these reasons could be of interest to you. And then we'll cover the idea of participating in clinical research, and if you're so interested, how to get involved. And I'll end with a short list of things I consider to be rather important to keep in mind as you contemplate participating in clinical research. And hopefully there'll be time for some Q&A. So, clinical research. There's a variety of different types of clinical research, but the key thing to keep in mind here is that when we talk about clinical research, we're talking about people. Clinical research involves people. So no people, no clinical research. You might hear or read about other types of research referred to as preclinical research mostly. And that more or less means research before we include people. So again, within clinical research, and I'll get into this, there's a variety of different flavors, so to speak. But the bulk of this afternoon, I will focus on an area of clinical research that deals with bringing new drugs. So for instance, if there's a new drug to treat and control anemia or high blood pressure, it's just as two examples. New drugs, new medical devices, so for instance, a new dialysis machine, a new dialyzer, a new stent, those are all considered medical devices. We'll talk about the flavor of clinical research that brings new drugs and new devices to market and makes those available to patients. Just real quickly, I'll give you flavors of some of the other types of clinical research. So there's clinical research that looks at existing drugs and devices that are already approved. There's also studies that look at just differences in therapies. So for instance, a clinical researcher may be interested in determining whether it's better to dialyze longer or not so long, or more frequently or less frequently. Those are not the types of studies that I'm focused on this afternoon. I'm focused on how do we bring new drugs, new medical devices to market. And so with that in mind, I can summarize clinical research this way. It's all about trying our best to ensure safety. So is this new drug or new medical device safe in people? And to demonstrate efficacy, which is a way to say, does it work? Does it work the way that we intended it to work? So if we have a new drug that is intended to treat anemia and maintain hemoglobin levels, does it actually do that? And so regardless of the type of clinical research, it all goes on, all of it, with a view to improving quality of life, finding cures, and improving health care that's delivered to patients, much like I would presume to be yourselves. So, get into the meat of this. I've mentioned a couple of concepts so far, and I'd like to spend a few minutes diving into those. So this slide and the next will help us look first at the entire process of bringing new drugs to market. And then we'll spend some time more specifically on just the clinical research piece. I think it's important to understand the whole process. I'll also say this. The process of moving a medical device to approval and to market is a bit different than it is for new drugs. But the process for new drugs is a bit more rigorous than it is for medical devices. So I'm going to focus on drugs this afternoon, not so much on devices. But we don't lose anything in this because of what I just said, that drug development is more rigorous than medical device development. So, let's first consider the entire process. It begins with discovery. So you can think of this stage as someone sitting in a laboratory, they're coming up with new ideas and trying to prove that this new idea or this new concept is viable. And this is an area that also includes, as I said before, preclinical research. So this is all before we come into a stage of introducing this new drug to people. And even at this stage, before we introduce it to people in this preclinical discovery still sort of stage, there's very, very, very prescribed and very well-defined studies that have to be performed if this new idea, this new drug, ever has a hope of reaching clinical development. And so the objective at this stage is, as best as possible, to get a sense of how potentially the body might react to this new drug and process this new drug. But the challenge, of course, is that you're trying to understand these things before you can bring this new drug into people. Right? You don't have approval to do that yet. Is one way of phrasing that. And that approval, if you're lucky enough to get it, comes from the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. And in fact, the FDA regulates the entire drug development and approval process with a set of guidelines that appear, if you're interested, in the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, in Section 21. So if you ever have difficulty sleeping one night and you're interested in this stage of clinical development or drug development, Code of Federal Regulations, Section 21. For approval to move into clinical trials, the FDA requires that a researcher submit what's called an IND, an investigational new drug application. All the detail of an IND, an investigational new drug application, also appears in Code of Federal Regulations, happens to be Part 312. So let's assume that we've submitted our IND to the FDA. The FDA has looked at that and says, yes, it's approved. You can now move on to clinical trials. We've been lucky so far. And I should point out here that very few potential new drugs make it even this far. And even fewer still will make it to market. And I'll have some more details on that in another moment. But first, let's look at clinical. All right, so just in that clinical development phase. So again, the FDA has approved our investigational new drug application, our IND, and now we're ready to enter clinical trials. Before getting into each of these clinical trial phases, I want to talk about three very important items that have to do with every clinical trial. The first is the protocol. Spend some time on that in a moment. The Institutional Review Board, the IRB, and the Informed Consent Form, the ICF. So let's take those three one by one. First, every clinical trial is defined by a clinical trial protocol. Protocol is a document that very clearly defines in very fine, almost excruciating detail how the study will be conducted, and it also defines who and who cannot participate. So there's a whole section within a protocol that defines this inclusion and exclusion criteria. So not everyone can participate in every clinical trial. Second, no clinical trial moves ahead until the protocol and the informed consent form, which I'll speak about in just a second, until the protocol and the ICF, the informed consent, are approved by an institutional review board, an IRB. In some places, this institutional review board is called an independent ethics committee. In some places, it's an ethical review board or a research ethics board. Depends on which country we're talking about. I'm focused here, obviously, just on the U.S., and so I'll refer to everything in this bit as an IRB, Institutional Review Board. But regardless, no matter what you call it, the IRB ensures that appropriate steps are taken to protect the rights and welfare of people participating in a clinical research study. The IRB is made up of people who are entirely independent of the study and the researchers, and is typically made up of people from diverse backgrounds, including both scientists and non-scientists. So the IRB, again, just to sum that up, the IRB is responsible for ensuring that this is an ethical study and that the safety and welfare of the people participating are protected. And third among those three things, again, the protocol, the IRB, and now the informed consent. So the informed consent form. Every clinical trial has an informed consent form. The informed consent, otherwise the ICF, is written in layman's terms, and it's meant specifically for the person who may be considering participating in a study. It outlines the study, and it also outlines your rights as a potential participant. ICF forms can be very long and very detailed, but again, in layman's terms. But they're incredibly important to you if you're considering participating in a clinical study. In fact, I would say it's probably the most important document to pay attention to if you do plan to participate in a study. So I wanted to get those three things out of the way. Those are important concepts: the protocol, the institutional review board, and the informed consent form. So let's put that aside for a moment and talk about clinical research again. So clinical research starts with studies that are known as phase 1 studies, or sometimes known as first-in-human studies. These are generally relatively small in terms of the number of people involved. And the primary objective in these early studies is simply to demonstrate safety. Is the drug safe? So we'll also be looking at this stage at how the body reacts to the drug, how the body processes the drug, how the drug is distributed in the body, and how the drug is excreted from the body. And we're probably at this stage also looking at a range of dosages. And we're trying to figure out which dosage has or holds the most therapeutic promise. So, as is often the case, too much of something is typically not good. And in fact, sometimes too little of something is not good. So what we're looking for here is 20 milligrams the right dosage, or is it 2, or is it 200? And these studies typically include what are known as healthy volunteers, not patients. So again, because the point of these early clinical phase 1 studies is to prove safety, we're not yet looking at efficacy. In other words, we're not yet looking to determine that this drug actually does what we intend it to do. Phase 1 studies are also typically, so you know, conducted in a dedicated clinic where the volunteers in this particular class of studies are housed and observed for a few days. So if all that looks good in phase 1, we move on to phase 2, and phase 2 includes a larger group of people. And it's here now that we need patient volunteers, not healthy volunteers, because now we're looking at efficacy. Does it work the way it intended? In addition, of course, and this is always the case, in addition to monitoring safety. We're always looking at safety in every study. But it's here in phase 2 where we first start looking at efficacy. And so, as an example, again, does the drug treat the condition of interest? If we're interested in treating high blood pressure, does this drug do that? That's the purpose of these phase 2 studies. Does this high blood pressure drug control high blood pressure, but does it do anything else? Perhaps there's things that it affects that we don't want it to affect. And so now we're beginning to understand and investigate possible side effects. Assuming we don't have anything that's cause for concern in phase 2, we'll move on to phase 3. And this is an even larger group of patients. I know the slide says hundreds to thousands of patients. It can be many, many thousands of patients. And these are typically, not always the case, but typically very large global studies. And again, all we're doing here is two things. We're ensuring that the drug is safe and that it works as intended, safety and efficacy. And once we've conducted all of these studies, and it's not sequential, and it's not that there's just one phase 1 study and then one phase 2 study and then one phase 3 study. Often there are multiple studies all happening concurrently. Right? So it's not we move from one to the other. You may go from phase 1 to phase 2 and then drop back and have to run another phase 1. But once we've conducted all of these studies and we've collected all the data, a massive amount of data, and we've analyzed it all, we submit now to the FDA what is a new drug application, an NDA. Again, this is all in the Code of Federal Regulations. And an FDA is typically, an NDA, a new drug application. In the old days, if a pharmaceutical company would literally back a truck up to the FDA building and unload boxes and boxes of documents. Today it's all done electronically. But the NDA is a massive document. And after all that work, the FDA may approve our NDA. They may approve it with certain conditions, like they might want to see certain words in the label, for instance. Or they may say, nope, we don't like this, go back and run more studies and submit and resubmit later. But assuming they approve our NDA, we can consider now that we have an approved drug that physicians can prescribe for patients. But even though we're approved, the FDA has approved our new drug, the FDA requires us to run what are known as phase 4 studies, sometimes called post-marketing or post-approval studies. And these are more what I'll call real-world type studies to assess long-term safety in lots and lots of patients who are prescribed this drug. And so it's a long process, a solid 10 years. 10 years is probably progressive. It's a very costly process. The latest estimates are that it's $2.5 billion with a B, $2.5 billion to get a new drug to from the laboratory to market. And as I said earlier, very few potential new drugs make it this far. I've seen figures that would suggest only 1 in 10,000 actually make it out of a laboratory and receive FDA approval. So let's move on from there. To give you a sense of the world of clinical research. So at the moment, there are roughly 250,000 clinical trials underway. That's a worldwide number. 254,000 clinical trials that are currently active. Of the 254,000, 44,000 roughly are what we'll call open to enrollment. These are studies that are still seeking people to participate in them, still seeking volunteers to participate. And so why is all of this important? Why should you care? Well, I hope you've gotten the idea that you can't advance the science of renal therapies. We can't bring new therapies to market, not just renal therapies, of course, but any. We can't bring new drugs to market that have the potential to help people without people willing to participate in clinical studies. Clinical studies are about people. No people, no volunteers, no studies. And interestingly enough, this pie chart would suggest 75% of U.S. adults believe that participating in a clinical trial is valuable. In fact, as valuable as donating blood. But only about 4% of the U.S. population actually participates in clinical research. And I suspect that 3 to 5% includes a not insignificant proportion that are what I'll call repeat participants. So they participate in a study, the study ends, and then they'll find another study to participate in. So the short of that is we need people. Well, who's needed? I said before, it's kind of two types of clinical studies. In the early phases, in phase 1, we're looking for healthy volunteers, people who don't necessarily have a particular disease condition. And then in later phase 2 and forward, we're of course looking for people with a particular condition, patients. I'll say here too that most studies, I've seen research that would suggest upwards of 90% of clinical studies, and there's 44,000 of them looking for patients right now. 90% of that 44,000 will not meet their timelines. And they'll not meet their timelines primarily because they can't find enough people to participate quick enough. So let's talk about reasons to participate. Some of these might be obvious. If you participate in a clinical study, you have the opportunity to perhaps try a new drug or a new therapy, one that may work, that may not, but may work better than the current drug you're on or the current therapy that you're on. There's no way to cure any diseases without clinical trials. There's no way, well, clinical trials help us find ways to improve quality of life. And I think for those people, that 4% of the population that does participate, I think the primary driver is simply, I like the idea of helping others. I'm sure there's other reasons, but I would suggest that these are probably closer to the top of the list commonly. So let's talk about how to get involved, should you be involved. I'd say that the first place to stop, or start, rather, is to talk with the folks in your life. Friends, family, caregivers, everyone will have a different opinion about clinical research. You will, I suspect, come across people who will throw out words like guinea pigs. I'd have a chat with your physician and his or her staff. If you're a dialysis patient, chat with the clinic staff. They're not all knowledgeable about clinical research, but you never know. You might find someone that is. And if you're a dialysis patient and you're at a clinic being dialyzed, and your fellow dialysis patients are participating in a study, and one of the ways to know is whether or not there are people visiting them who are not part of the clinic staff. If you see that, have a chat with your fellow patient and see what they think. This is an important point. Not all physicians, so I've said one place to start is to talk to your physician, and that's true. But keep in mind that not all physicians participate in research. Physicians who do participate in research are known as principal investigators, but not all physicians are principal investigators. And not all principal investigators participate in every clinical trial. So I'd ask your doctor if he or she is a principal investigator. And if so, well, that's great. He or she will know a lot about clinical research. And if your physician is not a principal investigator, then I'd suggest that the question to ask is whether or not one of maybe his or her partners is a PI, is a principal investigator. And if so, maybe you can have a chat with them. Other places to look and other ways to get involved, or at least to start and get involved. There's an organization called the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation. It's a wonderful resource for all the things that I don't have enough time to chat about this afternoon that have to do with clinical research and clinical research participation. A quick internet search for the Center for it's a long title, but that's the name of the organization, Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation. Again, great resource. The other place to look is clinicaltrials.gov. Clinicaltrials.gov is where pharmaceutical and medical device companies are required by law to post the details of the clinical trials that they are planning to conduct or are currently conducting. And you can filter the studies that are there for those that are looking for patients still. And then the other place to look would be the websites of companies who are participating in clinical research, and you'll find those on clinicaltrials.gov. there's a number of important things to keep in mind here. When you speak with your physician, ask a lot of questions. Do not be afraid. Do not be shy to ask questions. Every study is different. No two studies are the same. I assure you of that. Some studies will, as a participant, as a volunteer, as a patient volunteer in a clinical study, some studies will require more of your time. There'll be more of a demand on your time and attention than on others. That will be defined in the informed consent form. So that's something to pay attention to. Are you up for having to come in and visit your doctor more often than you normally do, as an example? Some studies compare one drug to another, and some studies compare one drug to a placebo. In those types of studies, you could wind up on a placebo rather than the drug that's being investigated. Some people don't like that idea. But again, not all studies are what are known as placebo-controlled studies. That would be the case here. Not all studies are placebo-controlled studies. So ask that question. You will know, even if you don't ask, you will be informed of that by way of the informed consent form. Keep in mind that you will not be eligible for every study. As I said earlier, there's a whole series of inclusion and exclusion criteria. So some studies may exclude patients with renal impairment. Some studies may include patients only that have renal impairment. Some studies may be looking for patients that have renal impairment and high cholesterol, or neither of those. Every study is different. So even though a study may look interesting, you may not be eligible for it for one reason or another. You can't participate in more than one study at a time. That's an important thing. And I'd say among this list, the most important thing to keep in mind is that you can always drop out of a study anytime for any reason. And that will be very clearly explained to you in the informed consent form. So even though you may be on a clinical study, and some of these studies run for years. Some the earlier phase ones, the phase 1 studies, a couple of days. The phase 2 studies could be weeks, could be a year, 2 years. The phase 3 studies could go on for 3, 4 years. But even if you were in a study for 4 years, you can at any point just say, yeah, I'm done. I'm not interested in participating anymore, and no questions asked. So I want to end where I started this afternoon by summarizing clinical research this way. It's all about people and ensuring safety and efficacy. And regardless of the type of clinical research, and we've covered a lot of different types, it all happens with a view to improving quality of life, finding cures, and improving health care, and how that health care is delivered to patients, much like yourselves. And so I've ended here where I've started. I've covered a lot of ground. I'm anticipating there'll be some questions for which we have, I think, plenty of time, and I will stop there.
Well, thank you so much, Kurt. If you wouldn't mind, I want to get the ball rolling with questions. And I was wondering, I guess, what's the best way? I know you mentioned talking to your physician or medical team about participating in a trial, but how does one even start to find anything or any sort of trial like this that they may be interested in or able to participate in?
Well, I say this, one of the best first places to look is to have a conversation with a physician, because if the physician happens to be a principal investigator, I mean, you can cut out some of the legwork here. If it so happens that your physician is a principal investigator on a particular study. If that's the case, then he or she will know certainly about that study and is likely to know about other studies that are out there. Again, if your physician is not a principal investigator, if that happens to be a dead end, I'd suggest the next place is that slide. I can back up to it. it will be the here. It'll be the Center for Information, CISCRIP. I'll just shorten that. And clinicaltrials.gov. So the clinicaltrials.gov website is a little clunky, but it's not too bad. I mean, you can go there and, for instance, filter on renal studies that are currently open for enrollment, and then you can look and see who, I haven't used this word this afternoon, but who the sponsor is, who is the researcher, who is the company behind that particular study. And then you can reach out to them through the website or say to your physician, hey, I looked at clinicaltrials.gov, there's this renal study with this company that looks interesting, can we talk about that? I think it just sum that all up, I think it all starts first with a conversation with your physician. Because you may just find that he or she says, oh yeah, I'm the principal investigator on this study. Are you interested? I didn't talk about, I'll just chat about this real quick. I didn't mention compensation, but most clinical studies will provide a stipend to patients. The stipend is not going to be lifestyle changing, certainly. There are rules around how large that stipend can be. It cannot be of a size that would induce you or influence you to participate. But it's meant to compensate you, for instance, if there happens to be what's called a study visit. So if you need to visit your physician for purposes of the study, you'll be compensated for that, the time and effort of that. So it's not, I would not consider participating in clinical research for financial reasons, certainly. Again, that CISCRIP website will cover a lot of that, certainly in more depth than we have time for this afternoon. Any other questions? I realize that's
Hello?
a lot of information.
Hello?
Yeah?
Yes?
I have a question, and I don't know if you can address this or not, if you know it or if it's even possible. But I heard Kurt say early on about finding cures. Are they looking for a cure for kidney disease? That's one part of the question. Or at least an ability to stop the progression of the kidney disease. If you're, I'm stage 3, is there a way, are they looking for a way to actually stop the progression of the disease if they can't find a cure?
There are people in the research community who are focused on that, yes, and focused on stopping the progression.
Is that even possible to do, though, Kurt? Because sometimes I don't know. I mean, there are ways or there are reasons that people get kidney disease, like high blood pressure, diabetes, things like that. But if you don't have any of that and you still have kidney disease, is there a way to stop the progression, and are they looking at that?
Is there? I'm not a nephrologist, so I'm giving you my opinion here. I don't. To answer part of the question, is there a way to stop the progression? I don't think there is currently an approved. I'll say it that way. An approved therapy to stop the progression, full stop of kidney disease. Is that something that's possible? Well, I hope so. And there are researchers who are trying to make that possible. There's also
that is a clinical trial. Then is that what you're telling me?
It's not a clinical trial that I am personally aware of. It is an area that is still, I think, in early development.
Okay.
But I would suggest taking a look at clinicaltrials.gov and seeing what's there. In fact, after this, I will personally do that myself. But I do know that there are efforts being made in that space to stop the progression of kidney disease. There's also a whole bunch of other sort of futuristic, I'll call it, things going on in the world. But many of those. So, for instance, like 3D printing of kidneys, very sort of futuristic. That hasn't reached clinical trials yet. That's still in the early discovery laboratory phase.
Okay, so it is in the works, and it is maybe possible that I think everybody that has kidney disease would like to know if there is a way or if there will be a way to either cure it or stop the progression. So.
Well, I can answer it this way. We won't, without people willing to volunteer for these clinical trials, we can't hope to come up with a good answer there. We need
right.
So
the best way to find that out is to go into clinicaltrials.gov and see what's out there.
I would say have a chat with your nephrologist or physician of choice, probably nephrologist, first, and then after that, take a look at clinicaltrials.gov.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
This is Kathy. While you were talking, I did look at clinical trials, and it does say that there's one study that's looking at the effect of SNF472 on progression of cardiovascular calcification in end-stage renal disease patients. So it does. I just kind of typed in something with progression of kidney disease. So people can look pretty easily, at least to get started on that website by state or by topic. So,
okay. Is that the clinicaltrials.gov one that you were talking about? That's the only one. I mean, I couldn't write fast enough to get everything down that Kurt was talking about. But is that the one that you looked at?
Yes, I put clinicaltrials.gov, and then in the condition disease, I put stop progression of kidney disease, just based on what you were saying. So, but it looks like you can put some terms and go by state if you want as well. So, certainly worth a look, I would say.
Okay, I will definitely.
I'm sorry.
I will definitely do that. Thank you.
Sure. Could I also wanted to just check back with you? So somebody who participates in a trial do they at any point get any information back about the trial or about the results of the trial?
That is a fantastic question because it is an area that the researchers and the sponsors and the drug companies have received criticism around. It has historically been the case that you would participate in a clinical study, the clinical study would end, and you would never hear about the results or what happened or the outcome. There's efforts being made to fix that. So that's one of the questions that I would ask if I were interested in participating in a clinical study. I would ask the principal investigator, what is the plan for keeping me informed after the study has ended? Or is there a plan? And if so, what is it?
Okay, good. Is it up to the clinical trial folks who are sponsoring it to market the research in terms of finding the people for it? Would they go into dialysis facilities or post things at dialysis facilities for recruitment, or does that not happen?
So it's ultimately the principal investigator who will recruit patients into a clinical study. There's different mechanisms for that. you might see, so here in Boston, if you ride the T, the train, there'll be ads for participating in clinical studies, and there'll be a website or a phone number or something like that. Occasionally, you'll see ads on television or hear them on radio or see them in the newspaper or on the web. But in the end, it's the principal investigator who will, they use the word recruit, it is the principal investigator who will recruit a patient into or for a study. And if that patient is interested and eligible, remember that's an important thing, and eligible for that study, then that patient would be enrolled by the principal investigator into the study. And that's where this informed consent form comes up.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, not hearing or seeing any on the chat. But I'd like to thank you so much for sharing this information, such important information with us today. I'd also like to remind everyone that you will find additional information in an article written by Kirk, which is in our current newsletter that many of you have received. A few people might not have received it yet. And the newsletter will also be available electronically on our website. So please take a look at that as well. I also encourage everyone to complete the feedback form that you'll see at the end of this program. And we will be back in touch. We will start our 2018 webinar series towards the end of January. And so you can watch for that on our website as well. And again, Kurt, thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. It was a lot of fun. And I'm available if anyone wants to drop me an email. I'm happy to answer questions offline from here. If you just go to Vernova Renal Research, I think you'll find my email address there.
Oh, great. Thank you for that opportunity. And I think I will always look at getting drugs differently now, as every time I get a prescription, I will think of all the stages and the steps that went into making that available to me. So again, thank you for all the information you shared.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone, for participating.
Thank you.
Happy holidays. Sure.
Merry Christmas.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.